Hi, my love. Now close your eyes and breathe slow. Take a breath in and let it go. Feel your hands grow warm, your feet soften. Let the day drift by, like clouds fading in the evening sky. Tonight, let me tell you what really happened on July 19th, 64 AD, when the greatest city in the world almost burned to the ground. Picture this. It's a hot summer night in 64 AD. You're in Rome, the biggest city in the world. 1 million people live here, packed into wooden apartment buildings that tower 7 stories high. The streets are narrow. Everything is made of wood and thatch. Oil lamps flicker in every window. Then a fire starts. You've heard the story before. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. But here's the thing, that story is completely wrong. Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started, and when he got back, he didn't stand around playing music. He grabbed a bucket and ran into the burning city to help fight the flames. Chapter 1. The Spark. The fire started in a shop. Not in some fancy palace, but in a regular store, where a man named Marcus sold leather goods and oil to people going to the chariot races. Marcus was 43, a former slave who had worked his way up to owning his own business. He had a wife, 2 kids, and the small apartment 3 floors up in a wooden building. On July 18th, Marcus stayed late at his shop to get ready for race day. The Circus Maximus, Rome's giant racing stadium, could hold 250,000 people. When the races were on, merchants like Marcus made good money selling to the crowds. But Rome had been baking in the heat all summer. No rain for weeks. The wooden buildings were dried out like kindling. Wells were running low. The city was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Marcus locked up his shop after sunset and walked home through streets that were still radiating heat. He climbed the creaky wooden stairs to his apartment, listening to the sounds of families having dinner, children playing, people living their normal lives. He had no idea that back in his shop an oil lamp had been knocked over. Maybe a cat bumped it. Maybe the old wooden counter just shifted in the heat. But the flame caught a piece of cloth, then spread to the wooden walls. By the time anyone noticed, 3 shops were burning. The fire department, called the Vigiles, rushed to the scene with leather buckets and bronze pumps, but they were too late. The fire was already jumping from building to building. Rome was about to face the worst disaster in its history. Chapter 2. The wind rises. Around midnight, the wind picked up. This was the worst possible thing that could happen. The breeze grabbed burning pieces of wood and cloth and threw them across the narrow streets. Every ember that landed started a new fire. Gaius Suetonius commanded the Roman fire department. He'd been fighting fires for 15 years, and he knew Rome's buildings were death traps. Wooden structures built too high, packed too close together, filled with oil lamps and cooking fires. He'd seen smaller fires kill dozens when people couldn't escape down the narrow staircases. But this fire was different. It seemed to have a mind of its own, leaping from building to building faster than his men could move. The wind carried burning debris hundreds of feet, starting fires in 3 directions at once. By dawn, an entire neighborhood was burning. The flames were climbing toward the rich people's marble houses on Palatine Hill. They were racing toward the Forum, where the government buildings were. They were devouring the shops around the Circus Maximus, where Marcus had worked. People started running. Families grabbed what they could carry and fled toward the Campus Martius, a big open field where they might be safe. The streets filled with smoke so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Children got separated from their parents. Old people collapsed from the heat. Marcus woke up to the smell of smoke and people screaming outside. When he looked out his window, he could see orange flames reflecting off the buildings across the alley. His shop was gone. Everything he'd worked for was burning. But there was no time to think about it. He woke his family and joined the river of people running for their lives. Chapter 3. Where was Nero? Here's where the famous story gets it wrong. Nero wasn't in Rome when the fire started. He was 30 miles away in Antium, a beach town where he'd gone to escape the summer heat. Rich Romans always left the city in summer. It was too hot and smelly to stay. When a messenger arrived with news of the fire, Nero immediately ordered his fastest horses prepared. He raced back to Rome through the night, changing horses at stations along the road. This is important because it proves the fiddling while Rome burns story is impossible. First, fiddles wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. Second, Nero wasn't even in the city when it started burning. The emperor arrived in Rome on the second day of the fire to find a third of the city in flames. The sight was like something from a nightmare. Smoke columns rose so high they could be seen from miles away. The air was full of ash and the sound of buildings collapsing. Tacitus, a Roman historian who lived through this, wrote about what happened next. Even though Tacitus usually criticized Nero harshly, he had to admit that the emperor's response was impressive. Nero immediately opened his own gardens to refugees. He ordered emergency shelters built in the open spaces. He brought in food from the countryside and set fair prices so merchants couldn't take advantage of desperate people. But then Nero did something no Roman emperor had ever done before. He went into the burning city himself. With a small group of guards and firefighters, Nero walked through the smoke-filled streets. People saw him carrying buckets of water, helping tear down buildings to stop the fire from spreading, personally directing the evacuation of trapped families. Pliny the Elder, who witnessed these events, wrote that Nero worked without rest for 3 days and nights. The emperor's clothes were burned and torn. His face was black with soot. He slept on the ground with the refugees and ate the same simple food that was given to everyone else. This wasn't the behavior of a man who wanted to see his city burn. Chapter 4. The Fire's Appetite. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire ate Rome. It burned through 14 different districts, completely destroying 3 and badly damaging 7 others. The flames were so hot they melted bronze and cracked marble. Buildings that had stood for centuries turned to ash in hours. The fire seemed intelligent, finding every weakness in the city's defenses. It followed wooden walkways that connected buildings across narrow streets. It raced through the sewers and popped up blocks away to start new fires. It climbed the wooden stairs of apartment buildings, trapping families on the upper floors. In the Subura district, where the poorest Romans lived, entire blocks disappeared in a single night. These were people who had no country houses to escape to, no money stored in banks in other cities. They lost everything and had nowhere to go except the refugee camps. An old woman named Livia sold bread from a small stall near the Forum. She had lived in the same tiny room for 40 years, ever since her husband died fighting in Germany. Everything she owned fit in one wooden chest. A few clothes, some coins she'd saved, a small bronze mirror that had belonged to her mother. When the fire reached her street, Livia grabbed her chest and joined the crowd running toward the river. But the chest was heavy and she was 73 years old. After a few blocks, she had to leave it behind. She never saw any of her things again. Stories like Livia's happened thousands of times across the burning city. Families got separated in the smoke and never found each other again. Children lost their parents. Merchants lost the work of a lifetime in one night. The fire destroyed more than just buildings. It burned the temple of Jupiter, where Romans had worshipped for centuries. It destroyed the Regia, the ancient palace of Rome's first kings. It consumed libraries full of scrolls that could never be replaced. Workshops where craftsmen had perfected their skills over generations. Homes where families had lived for hundreds of years. But the fire wasn't done yet. Chapter 5. Desperate Measures. On the fourth day, when it looked like the fire might consume the entire city, Nero made a heartbreaking decision. He ordered his soldiers to tear down entire blocks of undamaged buildings to create fire breaks, empty spaces too wide for the flames to cross. This was an agonizing choice. Many of the buildings marked for destruction were perfectly fine, their owners begging the soldiers to spare their homes and shops. But Nero had talked to his engineers and fire commanders. It was the only way to stop the fire. The demolition work was dangerous and heartbreaking. Soldiers used ropes and pulleys to pull down walls, while families watched their homes turn to rubble. Some buildings were so well built, they had to be burned deliberately to bring them down fast enough. Marcus Flavius, the merchant who had lost his shop, volunteered to help with this work. His business was already gone, but he joined the crews tearing down buildings near the Forum, hoping to save the heart of the city. The work was exhausting. Men worked in shifts around the clock, their hands bleeding from handling rough stone and splintered wood. But it worked. The fire breaks held just long enough for the wind to change direction. On the sixth day, it finally started to rain. The first moisture Rome had seen in weeks. The drops hissed when they hit the hot stones, sending up clouds of steam. By the seventh day, the great fire was finally under control. But Rome was a different city. Huge areas that had been crowded with buildings were now empty fields of ash. The population was scattered in camps and temporary shelters. The economic life of the empire was shattered. Nero stood on Palatine Hill, looking out over the devastation. From up there he could see the full extent of the damage, where the busy neighborhoods of the Subura and the Labrum had been. Now there were only blackened ruins stretching to the horizon. The emperor was 30 years old and he had just witnessed the worst disaster in Roman history. But instead of giving up, witnesses said Nero seemed energized, already making plans to rebuild. Chapter 6. The rumors start. Even before the ashes cooled, people in the refugee camps started whispering. Some said Nero had started the fire himself, that he wanted to clear the land to build a new palace. Others claimed they'd seen the emperor's men setting fires in different parts of the city. These stories spread fast among people who had lost everything and needed someone to blame. The rumors were encouraged by Nero's political enemies, senators who opposed his policies and saw the disaster as a chance to turn people against him. The accusations seemed to make sense when Nero announced his rebuilding plans. The new Rome would have wider streets, better fire safety, and more open spaces. Buildings would be shorter and required to have stone foundations. It would be safer and more beautiful than the old city. But, to his enemies, these improvements looked like proof of guilt. Why would Nero have such detailed plans ready so quickly unless he'd been planning the fire all along? The truth was simpler. Roman architects and engineers had been proposing these same safety measures for decades. After every fire, experts warned that the city's wooden buildings were disasters waiting to happen. Nero was just finally implementing reforms that had been discussed for years, but never acted on because of cost and politics. Tacitus, writing decades later, investigated these accusations carefully. He interviewed survivors, examined official records, and talked to other historians. His conclusion was clear. There was no evidence that Nero had started the fire. The emperor's response had been remarkably effective and compassionate. But Tacitus also understood something important about human nature. When people suffer a great loss, they need someone to blame, especially someone with power. The idea that the fire was just a random accident, that all their suffering had no meaning, was harder to accept than believing it was caused by an evil person who could be punished. So, the rumors kept spreading, growing more elaborate each time they were told. Some claimed Nero had recited poetry while watching the city burn, inspired by the destruction to write verses about the fall of Troy. Others said he had played his lyre and sung while standing on a tower watching the flames. None of these stories were supported by evidence, but they became part of history anyway, repeated by writers who hadn't witnessed the events themselves. Chapter 7: Finding Someone to Blame. As months passed and rebuilding began, Nero faced a political crisis. The rumors about his role in the fire continued to spread, and his popularity was declining. The emperor needed to find someone else to blame for the disaster. Someone the people would accept as the real villain. He found his scapegoats in Rome's small Christian community. Christianity was still new and poorly understood in 64 AD. Most Romans knew little about Christian beliefs, except that they refused to worship the traditional gods and talked about the world ending. To many people, Christians seemed like a secretive cult that threatened Roman values. Nero's advisors suggested Christians would make perfect scapegoats. They were already unpopular. They had no political power to defend themselves, and their talk about the end times could be twisted to suggest they had wanted to destroy the city. The persecution that followed was brutal. Christians were arrested throughout the city and given horrific punishments. Some were crucified. Others were burned alive as human torches to light Nero's garden parties. Still others were thrown to wild animals in the arena for crowd entertainment. These executions were meant to satisfy the public's desire for revenge and deflect blame from Nero. For a while, it worked. Many Romans were satisfied that the real criminals had been found and punished. But the persecution also revealed something disturbing about Nero's character. While he had shown genuine compassion during the fire, he was willing to sacrifice innocent people to protect his political position. The same man who had risked his life to save Romans from flames was now ordering other Romans to be burned alive. This contradiction would define how history remembered Nero. His real efforts during the fire were forgotten, while his cruelty toward Christians became part of his legend. Chapter 8: The New Rome Rises. Rebuilding Rome took nearly a decade, but the result was amazing. The new city that rose from the ashes was more beautiful and much safer than the old one. Streets were wider, buildings were shorter and fire-resistant, and there were more open spaces where people could gather or escape in emergencies. Nero's new palace, called the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, became one of the wonders of the ancient world. It covered more than 300 acres and included gardens, artificial lakes, and innovative features like a rotating dining room. Critics said it proved Nero's selfishness, that he had burned the city to make room for his own luxury. But the palace was only part of a much larger rebuilding program. Nero also built new public baths, theaters, and markets. He improved the city's water supply and sewage systems, He created parks and recreational areas for ordinary citizens. The new Rome wasn't just grander than the old city, it was more livable for everyone. The new building codes Nero implemented became the model for cities across the empire. Requirements for stone foundations, limits on building height, mandatory open spaces between structures, these innovations saved countless lives in future fires and earthquakes. Marcus Flavius, the merchant who had lost his shop, eventually reopened his business in one of the new commercial districts. The building was made of stone and brick instead of wood, with wider doorways and better ventilation. It cost more to rent, but it was much safer. Marcus lived to see his children grow up and have children of their own, something that might not have been possible in the old Rome with its constant fire danger. Livia, the old bread seller, wasn't so fortunate. She died in a refugee camp during the winter after the fire, one of thousands of elderly and poor Romans who couldn't survive the displacement and hardship. Her story was repeated countless times, a reminder that disasters always hit the powerless hardest. The new Rome attracted visitors from across the Mediterranean. Architects came to study the building techniques, merchants came to do business in the improved markets. Artists came to see the magnificent decorations in the public buildings. But the most important change was invisible. The new Rome was designed around the idea that government had a responsibility to protect its citizens from disaster. This was a radical concept in the ancient world, where most rulers saw their job as conquest and tax collection, not public safety. Chapter 10. Lessons from the Ashes. What can we learn from the fire that almost destroyed Rome? The disaster revealed both the fragility of human civilization and its incredible resilience. In just 6 days, centuries of building and culture were reduced to ash. But within a decade, a new and better city had risen from the ruins. The fire showed the importance of urban planning and building codes. Rome's original design, with its narrow streets and wooden buildings, was a disaster waiting to happen. The new Rome, with its wider streets and stone construction, was much safer. Modern cities still use principles that were first implemented in Nero's rebuilding program. The disaster also demonstrated the crucial role of leadership during a crisis. Nero's immediate response, opening his palace to refugees, organizing food distribution, personally joining the firefighting effort, probably saved thousands of lives. His later scapegoating of Christians was morally wrong, but it didn't erase the good he had done during the emergency itself. Perhaps most importantly, the fire showed how quickly false stories can spread and become accepted as truth. The myth of Nero fiddling while Rome burned was believed for centuries, even though it was completely contradicted by eyewitness accounts. People wanted to believe it because it made the complex tragedy easier to understand. The refugees who fled the burning city carried their stories to every corner of the Roman Empire. Some told the truth about what they had seen, the emperor working alongside common citizens to fight the flames. Others repeated the rumors about Nero's guilt. Over time, the rumors became more popular than the facts. This is how historical myths are born. They start with a grain of truth, get embellished through retelling, and eventually become more believable than the actual events they're based on. The story of Nero and the fire is a perfect example of how legend can overpower history. But the physical evidence tells a different story. Archaeologists have found the remains of the buildings destroyed in the fire, the layers of ash and debris that mark where the flames passed. They've uncovered the foundations of Nero's rebuilding program, the improved drainage systems and fire-resistant construction techniques that made the new Rome safer. The stones don't lie. They tell the story of a city that was devastated by accident, led through crisis by an imperfect but dedicated ruler, and rebuilt stronger than before. As you lie here in the quiet darkness, safe in your own bed, far from the smoke and flames of ancient Rome, you might wonder which version of the story to believe. Was Nero the monster of popular imagination? Or was he a flawed but ultimately heroic figure who did his best in an impossible situation? Perhaps the answer is that he was both and neither. He was a human being, capable of both great compassion and terrible cruelty, just like the rest of us. The fire revealed all aspects of his nature, the part that would risk everything to save strangers, and the part that would sacrifice innocence to save himself. The flames that consumed Rome for 7 days and nights burned away more than just buildings. They burned away illusions about power and virtue, about heroes and villains, about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of tragedy. In the end, the fire was just fire, as natural and mindless as lightning or earthquake. It was human beings who gave it meaning, who decided what lessons to draw from the ashes, who chose which stories to remember and which to forget. Today, you can visit Rome and walk through the ruins of Nero's Golden House. You can see the foundations of the buildings that were destroyed in the fire and rebuilt afterward. You can stand in the Circus Maximus, where Marcus had his shop, now a peaceful park where people walk their dogs and children play. The Tiber River still flows past the ancient city, just as it did on that terrible night in 64 AD. The 7 hills still rise against the sky, but the wooden buildings that made the fire so devastating are long gone, replaced by stone and brick structures that have stood for centuries. Modern Rome has faced other disasters: earthquakes, floods, wars, plagues. But the city has always rebuilt, always adapted, always found a way to continue. The fire of 64 AD was just one chapter in the story that spans nearly 3,000 years. As the ancient city sleeps beneath its layers of history, as the moon rises over the ruins of emperors and the dreams of ordinary people, you can close your eyes and let the weight of all that time settle gently around you like a warm blanket. The fire is out. The city is rebuilt. The people are safe. And you, here in your own time and place, can rest knowing that even the greatest disasters pass, even the darkest nights end, and even the most terrible stories can have redemption hidden in their ashes. Sleep well and remember, the eternal city endures, and so do the lessons written in its stones.